Thanks for coming, Brian.
Thanks, Tyler.
So I'm here with Brian Bajari. He's a local minister. He's a theologian, Ivy League scholar, friend of the homeless, hungry, and the traumatized everywhere. Welcome. Thanks for coming, man.
Tyler, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here, dude.
Of course. Yeah, I got the opportunity to do an interview here for 831 Vibe, and of course, You're the first person I thought of. Love to get your story out there. So yeah, let's start off where I interact with you most, which would be the beach church.
Sure.
What is that, and where did that start?
Yeah. So to give people some kind of context, right? Some friends of mine and I were having a conversation about roughly 5 years ago, and we're kind of concerned about people who are living out in the streets, specifically in Monterey, and what can we do to quote unquote help the homeless, right? And a buddy of ours, actually a friend of mine, she said, hey, I really want to help. I want to do something. What can we do? I'm afraid as a single, she was actually married at the time, but still is married. She's like, I'm a little afraid of going out as a woman trying to help some of these guys who are out in the street. And so then her husband is a paramedic, and he happened to say, hey, look, outside of food, shelter, mental health, medical health, a simple thing that we can do is give some folks socks, clean socks. So we got our wheels turning, and we decided, hey, why not throw a big party at a local bar? Let's do a fundraiser for socks. So we'll do a sock hop. So we had this 50s style themed out sock hop party at a bar in Carmel, and the owner was all about that, and everybody dressed up, and it was a blast. We raised about 200 pairs of socks, a couple $100, and now we've got all these socks, all this money. We're like, okay, we got the socks, now what do we do? So, and I always believe, and I say this over and over again, that the best journeys are those that you have light enough just for the very next step. And so we're like, all right, we got this, now what's next? And a friend of mine had another friend that had just started a kind of distribution on Saturday mornings for homeless people outside on Windows by the Bay Beach, by the bike path, the volleyball courts, the kayak rental place. And he said, hey man, if we could use some of those socks, would you guys come down? And I said, absolutely. So we brought a bunch of socks down, and we started distributing those socks. And what happens when you start distributing socks to people you'd never normally talk to is it inevitably incurs kind of a conversation. And so the very first person I met ended up becoming one of my very best friends, a guy by the name of Anthony. And I handed him a pair of socks. He didn't really need the socks, but I think he took them anyway. And he said, I said, so how long are you in town for? He said, I just got here not too long ago. And he said, God always answers my prayers. And I said, well, what does that mean? God always answers your prayers. And he said, well, I was praying the other day. I was praying outside, and it was cold out here. And God, I could use a jacket because it's cool. And so I said, so what happened? And he said, well, God gave me a jacket. In fact, he gave me my favorite color, army green. I said, that's amazing. And he told me another story about how God answered his prayer. And actually, the bartender's brother at the time, his youngest daughter, who was 1, just had gone into this real severe disease where it incapacitated her entire body. She couldn't move any muscle. She was rushed up to Children's Hospital in San Francisco. And so I said, hey man, would you pray for my friend's little daughter? She can't breathe on her own. She's on a breathing machine, and she's not moving her legs or arms or any part of her body. She's a real sweet little girl. And he said, sure enough, and he put his arm around me and said, let's pray. Right here? And he said, why not? That's why I'm here today. And he started praying. And the great thing about that is, whether you believe in prayer or not, I believe there's some kind of incredible power when people get together and think and collectively reflect and pray for somebody in compassion. And over a period of a couple of months, we saw this little girl get progressively better, where the doctors were saying she might not ever get better, and if she did, it would take her at least a year to recover. Well, within 2 months, she started recovering, started moving her hands and arms, and got off the breathing machine. And then finally, the last piece of the puzzle was she couldn't speak. And so Anthony, my buddy, is praying for the last week, God, give her the voice of an angel for Christmas. And sure enough, she starts talking, and this beautiful miracle happens. So there's the beginnings, the genesis of what happened with the Beach Church. We started the distribution. And then eventually some of our friends said, Anthony said, hey, Brian, why don't we do a beach church on Sundays? We have the Saturday thing going. Why not Sundays? Because a lot of our friends are getting kicked out of churches. And so we started really small, and now it's been going for a few years now, and it's a beautiful thing.
Really beautiful thing. Now, you said friends were getting kicked out of churches, and you're referring to homeless people that were getting kicked out of churches at the time? That seems strange to me. What do you think about that? Like in terms of a church taking that route to deal with like the homeless and the disenfranchised.
That's a big question, and I'll try and answer that as compassionately as I possibly can. So I understand. So there are a lot of incredible local churches do a lot of incredible things. But the problem is that we often kind of stereotype. We have this image of what a homeless person is. And so when somebody comes in the door who's not dressed cleanly, who may smell, who may be a little bit inebriated or intoxicated, it immediately sounds warning bells that this person is unsafe and doesn't really belong in the midst of our congregation. And I understand this. They have families, they have children, and they want to keep their families and children safe. And sometimes, of course, our friends who are overly intoxicated don't know it, and they need that might not be the place for them to be because they're yelling or they're screaming or doing something. But for the vast majority of people who are outside, living outdoors, who are houseless or homeless, churches offer a refuge, a safe place where they can just be themselves. So we discovered that the beach was this beautiful alternative where it was really organic, that there was no agenda other than to get together, to pray, to read about the rhythms of Jesus. I call him the original heretic because he's always loving the wrong people at the wrong times, and he got persecuted for loving the wrong people at the wrong times. And then what ended up happening is we had a few people who started dying. Some friends who passed away on the streets of overexposure or intoxication. And so we found that this was a safe place to do memorial services for people to grieve and to simply mourn their friends, whereas they would not otherwise have that outlet to grieve publicly and remember their friends who have passed away on the streets. So this became a kind of a safe alternative for kind of a conventional building-based church for friends on the streets. And we don't want to compete against any other church. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that we want to offer a space for people who would not maybe otherwise be welcomed in other kind of church settings.
So it seems like you're of the belief that maybe it's not a malicious intent on the part of the churches or that they don't care, but maybe it comes from a place of fear or a misunderstanding.
That's a great way to align that. I think we live in a lot of churches, despite great intentions, a lot of people live in the rhythms of fear as opposed to the rhythms of love and compassion. I don't want to suggest that we be naive and say that every person that we meet on the streets is the safest person in the world.
Sure.
I mean, a lot of people are coming out of prison. They're just trying to find their way. A lot of people are still living in the rhythms of violence and of addiction. And so, yeah, fear definitely plays into that. But that doesn't mean that churches can't do anything. And what we're finding now that we've kind of done this, allowed this kind of space for our friends outdoors, that a lot of other area churches are beginning to align with us, and they're beginning to bring out food and medical teams, and that's huge. It's just kind of some members of congregations are awakening to that rhythm of real enlivened compassion to people who are marginalized in Monterey. And honestly, what people don't know about the homeless population in Monterey County is that Monterey Peninsula has the largest homeless population in all of Monterey County. And most people would think Salinas, but the last homeless census was the Monterey Peninsula. So
Wow.
really interesting.
That's really interesting. And you put yourself, going back to the fear that a lot of people can have, that knee-jerk reaction to seeing someone without nice clothes or that might smell bad. You put yourself around those types of people pretty much daily for the last few years. Do you feel that fear? Is that something that seems, what's your experience with them as someone that works day to day? Is that something that you feel, are you feeling in fear for your life associated with these people or your safety?
Yeah, I think you have to trust your gut. I think you got to be, like Jesus, I love Jesus, he said you got to be innocent as doves and as cunning as snakes. And I always kind of say, like, that's Jesus just saying you got to be street savvy, right? You got to be a little bit savvy. And there are people who are overly intoxicated and who are dangerous physically, and you got to be aware of that. Don't be naive. And a lot of well-intentioned people will say, well, I got to, if I meet a homeless person, then I got to fix all their problems. That's a naive approach. You're not going to fix anybody's problems. You can come alongside somebody and provide a sense of presence, of loving presence, but you're not going to fix somebody's problems. I think that's an American kind of mentality where, well, if we're going to tackle this problem, we got to tackle it and we're going to fix everybody's problem. That's just silly. So there are people that don't want help and they don't want any presence, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that everybody's like the person who doesn't want any help. There are a lot of homeless people that would rather not come to the feeds or the distributions, and I think there's a lot of probably shame playing over and over in their heads where they feel like they're not worthy to receive love or any kind of compassionate care, and that's okay. There's no forcing that on anybody. And certainly at our distribution, we've had to break up a few physical fights, and police come on Sunday mornings just to check if things are going okay, and that's part of the routine. That's really part of our liturgy: fist fights, drunken interruptions, stoned out conversations, and police showing up. But that's kind of part of the rhythm, and I think if you're willing to embrace that as part of the liturgy, then I think you'll be okay.
What an interesting baseline religion for a church. That's not what most people would think of when they think of a church. Is fist fights, stoned out arguments when cops come. But I love it. I've seen it personally. And last Sunday, I believe you guys actually did have some doctors coming down there to deal with the homeless people that don't usually get that care. And you're saying that you're not out to fix all of their problems. You're there to be present with them. And but a lot of the times, I think people do get concrete help, and a lot of problems do end up getting fixed. Do you have any, have there been any examples of, I don't know, I guess the most extreme case would be a person that's living on the streets through receiving compassion. So have you seen anyone be able to make it,
Sure.
off the streets, or any kind of real change?
Like sure. That happens more often than people imagine. And I think even 2 weeks ago at our Sunday Beach Church, we got a friend of ours, I'm going to call him John, came down. And John had been hanging out. I mean, if you know Monterey at all, on the bike path, that fence is full of a bunch of our homeless friends. And John had been hanging out there for a number of years. And he came down 2 Sundays ago and clean shaven and well dressed. And he came and said, hey, look, guys, I was here just a couple years ago, right on this fence, and I was hammered out of my mind. And it wasn't until I got to the point where I began to love myself. I needed to love myself and receive God's love for me, that things began to change in my living. And so now, he said, I'm sober. I'm back with my girlfriend. I've got a little child. I've got a job. I've got a new car. He said, you can make those changes. It's just the willingness to receive love from God and from other people and start making those steps. And everybody clapped for him. And he still has the missing teeth from some of his drug addictions, but the guy is lovely. The guy is amazing. And we have those stories all the time. It's just that's when we talk about homelessness, nobody really thinks about the reality of transition. My buddy Anthony, who's with us in the studio, I mean, he introduces me to people all the time. Anthony used to live on the streets. He's no longer living on the streets, but he's essentially he's a minister out among the people on the streets because he lived there. And he introduced me to one guy. I'm going to call him Jason. And Jason came back from Iraq, and he had post-traumatic stress disorder. He had divorced his wife. He had lost his job as kind of doing construction work, heavy equipment operation. He was drunk every night, thrown in the drunk tank. He was gambling because with PTSD, with post-traumatic stress, you always want to live on the edge. So gambling provided that outlet. And so he lost his money, and so he ended up living on the streets. And so, Anthony and myself, we just kind of started listening to his story because everybody has a story. And it's interesting what that does to the brain chemistry when somebody begins telling their story of tragedy, of hurt, of brokenness. It reframes that tragedy or that brokenness or that violence or that brutality into this reality that I'm worthy of being listened to without shame, without judgment. And I think as our friend Jason started telling his story and finding and receiving love, little by little, he stopped getting thrown in the drunk tank. And I remember one weekend he gave me a wad of cash, and he said, hold on to this, because I want to come back and have this money next week, and I don't want to gamble it away. And so little by little, and so you fast forward over a period of a year and a half, 2 years, he moves from getting off the streets, from getting thrown in the drunk tank, from gambling every week, to getting his job back, to enrolling with the GI Bill into Monterey Peninsula College. His wife comes out from Chicago. They get back together. They have a child. He's working. Not only that, he saves up enough cash and buys a home in Seaside, buys a house in this economy. From homelessness to being a house owner within a period of a year and a half to 2 years is amazing. And then he takes a vacation with his whole family to Hawaii, and they just had their second son not too long ago. And those stories happen, but they're never talked about in the media. It's always about the homeless issue, the homeless problem. What are we going to do about these mean bums on the street aggressively panhandling? And we don't look past the kind of rough exterior into the potential for transformation.
Yeah, you never hear about
No.
stuff like that. I mean, especially a story that dramatic of change,
Right.
And it seems to come from just people being there. Which brings me to a word you use a lot is compassion. And that's how I think you affect a lot of your change. And what exactly does that word mean to you? What do you see compassion as?
Right, so it gets back to story, right? Everybody has a story. And I believe the roots of compassion start with empathy. Empathy is kind of a disposition of listening to somebody's story without judgment or kind of a preconceived reality of shaming them. So if I enter into your story, I listen to your story, and it gets me to a greater understanding of who you are, what motivates you, what makes you passionate, what makes you cry, right? And so empathy kind of enlivens my kind of attention to your reality, to your rhythms. And so now I'm kind of in a sense connected to you. I see you in a different light, and so empathy gives us the disposition spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, to enter into the story. Now, let's say you suffer some kind of setback, right? And I'm already a part of that story because I've heard your story and I'm into what you're about. I'm going to want to be present with you in that setback. I'm not going to be able to fix your problem, but I want to be present to you and journeying with you for a season in that time of your life. Now, does that mean I fix your problems? No. But I believe that's what compassion is. It's kind of enlivened or embodied empathy. That compassion is the action of empathy, right? It makes us kind of want to be present. I mean, the great good parable of Jesus is the Good Samaritan, right? And if people don't know, it's a great story. It's one of the best stories ever told. It's out of Luke chapter 10. And what people don't understand, when we get this euphemism, Good Samaritan, what we don't understand is that Jesus, at the time, the Samaritans were the enemies of Jesus' people, the Jews in the first century Palestine. And Jesus is making the hero a Samaritan, the wrong person. And the two people that were supposed to really provide help, a priest and a Levite, they pass by the guy on the side of the road. But it's the enemy, the Samaritan, that comes alongside and has compassion on the guy on the side of the road and helps him. And Jesus is essentially pointing out, look, dude, this is what love looks like. It's not about kind of these solid religious lines or kinship lines or ethnic lines. It's about how we receive love and how that love pours out to other people who are hurting. And so that's kind of where I get my rhythm of compassion. It doesn't mean it's always about poor people. It can mean people who are marginalized in their own circumstances professionally, marginalized in their own circumstances in their family relationships, and coming alongside of those people and not fixing, but being present to. I hope that kind of clarifies some of how I rhythm into that a little bit.
Definitely. And and that doesn't seem to be something that's too present in our current homeless dialogue, as a society. It seems to be that we're looking for ways to hide the problem, pretty much the opposite of journeying in that suffering with someone. How do you think we could reframe how people look at the how do you look at the homeless problem that you think might be different from the way that mainstream society would look at our homeless? And like you say, I don't know if homeless problem is the right word, but yeah, of people being without housing, hungry, and without proper clothes. How do you look at that might be different?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. And actually, first I want to say, I think we've over-professionalized compassionate professions, right? Caregiving professions, right? So we think, well, I'm not the professional. We've over kind of certified compassion, right? I'm not the professional. I'm not the therapist. I'm not the psychologist. I'm not the psychiatrist. I'm not the religion, minister guru. So I really don't have the qualifications to help people. I think that's nonsense. I think that's utter nonsense. I think we're all gifted with a unique, mysterious, powerful, embedded reality of entering into the story of the other, right? So I would say the very first thing is understand that not every homeless person or one who lives outdoors or who is houseless is the old angry guy with a big beard and is always drunk and aggressively panhandling on the streets. In fact, that's one portion of the spectrum. The other spectrum that people don't see are the homeless families. People who live in tents in the woods, the people who are living in the working homeless, who are living in their cars, right? Who are working 2 or 3 jobs and don't have enough money to afford an apartment, who are working and they're sober, they're clean, and they're hardworking people, men and women. And so it's beginning to, instead of kind of passing by the issue of homelessness, like I don't want to give money, so I'm just not going to do anything. You don't have to give money. Maybe just say hello. Maybe just look at somebody in a human connection to reframe your own understanding about who this person on the street is. That person on the street didn't dream when they were 5 or 6 or 7 that they'd be on the streets. They probably had incredible dreams about doing something incredible with their living. But something happened along the way that placed them there. And so a simple hello, hey, I don't have change to give you right now, but what's your name? Oh, my name's Jack. Jack, good to meet you. Have a great day. I mean, I think people long for that human connection, and I think our friends on the streets long for that kind of human connection. There'll be very few people who will not take a greeting. Very few people on the streets will not take a greeting. There's that 1% that will say, F you, but don't let that become a personal issue. Allow that for your own understanding, that's that person's own understanding of themselves. So don't think that everybody is an angry homeless person. We have a woman right now who is a caregiver, and she's living in her car, and she's been working all of her life, but she had some setback recently in her living where she lost her job, and now and you look at her, she doesn't look homeless at all. She's beautiful, wonderful, articulate, smart, sober, but she's also homeless, right? And you think, man, she's model beautiful, and she's articulate. Wow, that's crazy. So I think it's entering into the story that the people who live outdoors, who are out on the streets, they have a story, and their story is worth listening to if you get to that point in a relational encounter.
And now I gotta call you out. I've seen you on the streets taking money from homeless people on the beach there. What is that about, man?
That's great. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, we take money. We take money from homeless people. That's pretty cool. Let's
Where does that go, though?
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah, so one of my favorite artists, street artists, is a guy named Meek. He's out of New Zealand, and he has this graffiti art. You can look him up. Just Meek, Meek, online. And there's this homeless guy with a hoodie on, and he's cross-legged with a styrofoam coffee cup in front of him. He's got a blanket over his legs, and he's got the cardboard sign. He's spanging is spare changing, panhandling, and and it says, graffitied on the top of the cardboard, it says, "Keep your coins, I want change." And I love that, because I think that's ultimately what we want. It's not money that's gonna solve people's problems. It's loving presence. I want change in my own disposition. And so a friend of mine at the beach church, she suggested one morning to me, her name's Gina, she's great. She's out there loving on people all the time. And she has a remarkable story herself in terms of her own life, but we'll get into that maybe another time. She said, "Brian, why don't we have an offering?" I said, "What? What do you mean offering?" She said, "Well, why don't we have these guys and these women, give money to an offering plate?" I'm like, "What? That's crazy. Why would we do that?" And she said, No, just trust me. She said, "There's method in my madness." She said, "When we start giving of ourselves, we start realizing we have the power to help other people." I said, "You're onto something, Gina." And so the next week she brought this old empty Crown Royal bottle in the velvet bag. And she kind of introduced this, saying, when you give out of your own resources, there's going to be this kind of abundance that you'll experience in your own living. And so we decided we'd give all of that loose change, those spare dollars, to friends that I've met overseas. And I've worked in refugee camps, and specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, where kids who've been abducted to be child soldiers or child sex slaves, they come back and they don't have any families, and so they're essentially homeless. They're internally displaced people. I met one kid named Jeffrey who his dad was beheaded in front of him, his mom was raped and killed in front of him, and he was abducted into the militia and was forced to do unspeakable acts of horror and violence. Well, he's scrapped in the slums, and he's found a way to survive. And then now our beach church is providing it's usually about $40 a month of loose change and spare dollars, and we send that to Jeffrey via Western Union, because in most sub-Saharan African contexts you have to pay to go to school, and really education is a pathway out of poverty. And so just the other day he Facebook messaged me and said, "Brian, thank you, I finished my exams, I'm doing well." Jeffrey is now 18, and he's trying to finish up his high school work, and he's got more school fees coming up this month, so he can finish off his high school work so he can find his way eventually into university. So you think about, wow, and I tell the story to our homeless friends, you guys are helping provide with this money to help another homeless kid around the globe to get into school to better his living so he can better his environment. And I think it's just powerful when people, the capacity for us to be connected as brothers and sisters around the globe, that homeless people actually are in Monterey are impacting people around the world, It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
And that chain keeps going a little further, doesn't it? Of helping homeless people who are then helping a guy in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
And he's taken it upon himself to help out. Does he have a child? What was the story there? Is that?
Oh yeah, well, so that's actually a different story, different guy.
Different guy.
Yeah, but no, Jeffrey is helping out his friends and trying to get them involved with school as well. So that's kind of the story there too. Yeah.
So you mentioned Africa, which is a place that you've been working with child slaves and rehabilitating them, if I'm right there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Where else has your work brought you in the world? Where have you gone?
Yeah, so most of my time has been in sub-Saharan Africa, in the northern Uganda region, bordering South Sudan and DR Congo, and then but in the spring I was in Gaza City in the Gaza Strip, which was a different kind of war zone, different kind of conflict zone. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's primarily we're working in post-traumatic cases where they're coming away from the militia, out of the armies, and into an environment that that they've left behind and they don't know anymore, and so they're reeling from the trauma that they've been through, that they've been brainwashed to kill with machetes or AK-47s. So we're dealing with those children, or sex violence, which is rampant, especially in these militias, and so we're trying to, in a sense, come alongside relief workers and relief agencies and collaborating with those organizations that are there long term, and how to do trauma counseling through art therapy, through music therapy, through narrative therapy. And so it's beautiful to see what's happened, what's transpired in this part of the region of Gulu, Uganda. And in Gaza, it's a different story. It's acute trauma. It's ongoing trauma. And so we're working, with children and their caregivers, and a lot of art therapy, drawing. What makes you scared? And inevitably in Gaza, it's always drones, right? Drones, or fourth graders are naming the name of Apache helicopters, right? Apache helicopter. They know when the woof 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 is coming, and so Apaches are jet fighters. And one instance, a kid drew a jet fighter coming over his neighborhood. And in Gaza, there are a lot of apartment buildings that go, really up to the sky. They're big, but they're not. The structures aren't always safe. And so he drew this jet fighter with these on the front of the jet with huge eyes, right, coming over his neighborhood, near his apartment building. And we asked him, well, what are these eyes? What are these eyes on this jet fighter? And the kid said, well, that jet fighter sees everything. It sees everything. And so it sees where we are, and it kills us where we are. So we found a lot of cross-pollination in, again, the narrative here is that everybody has a story. And whether you're homeless in Monterey, or whether you're in a conflict zone in Gaza, or whether you're coming back from a militia in sub-Saharan Africa, everybody has a story worth telling to somebody who is safe, in a safe place where there's not going to be shame and where there's not going to be judgment. Because inevitably, for children, especially in these conflict zones, what happens with the brain is, there's four parts of the brain: the brain stem, the midbrain, the limbic part of the brain, and the cortical part of the brain, right? And the cortical part, that's where we've got all the neural grooves. That's where all the thinking and compassion happens. But when some kind of violence or trauma happens, literally the brain shuts off, and you go into this kind of the limbic. And it goes really to the brain stem and the midbrain, where you're almost in survival mode. You kind of shut down. And so oftentimes we'll see kids who've shut down, they're catatonic and they're rocking back and forth. And so the hope is that there's compassionate presence so eventually they can begin telling their stories. So that eventually the brain literally begins to heal itself. And the brain is a remarkable function of our bodies. It is able to heal itself. And so the cortical part of the brain, the neural grooves, start firing again as you start telling your story. And parts of creativity and compassion and empathy start firing back and forth in your brain. And so a kid who tells a story to a safe person, a safe place, begins to find healing in that process. And we've seen that over and over again in some remarkable cases.
And I find it really interesting that, with the homeless church, with Africa, with the Middle East, you put yourself in a situation where you are involving yourself in some of the least desirable situations. I mean, you're going there, and like you said, when you hear someone's story and you really journey with them, you become involved in that story. And so, in placing yourself in these situations with just grief and the worst that the world has to offer, you still seem to retain this. I don't want to speak for you, but you seem to have a view that the world is good and that. And a hopeful view, and you seem to be a very happy person, despite the fact that you put yourself in these situations, in some of the least desirable situations in the world. Now, that seems to be, it doesn't seem to line up, logically. How do you account for that? What do you think? How do you think you're staying hopeful, or you retain a hope for the world when you're there up close seeing some of the most painful and terrible things that the world has to offer?
Sure. I have my moments, my weeks, my months where I'm undone. I'm blown apart. And usually on these trips when I go overseas and come back, it takes me some time to really reacclimate, because we're carrying our minds. It's kind of secondary traumatization. You carry the stories and the knowledge of the terrible with you. And you can't help but weep, and you can't help but get angry in terms of the violence that's being incurred around the world almost incessantly. But when you do listen to people's stories in these conflict zones, or even on the streets here in Monterey, you realize that there's some incredible people, beautiful, powerful people with incredible imaginations who can literally change how we understand one another. But sometimes we just kind of have to be willing to journey past the exterior of conflict zones or violence or the dirty exterior and go into the heart of somebody's story. And there you find laughter. There you find some sense of imagination and hope and joy. The first time I went to a IDP camp in Gulu, I was amazed.
The IDP?
Internationally displaced person, or internally displaced person.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like a refugee camp within its own country, and I was taking notes on what each of the children were wearing that I was working with, and they all had these, clothes, and I put the clothes with their names so I could remember them when I showed up the next morning. When I showed up the next morning, all the kids were there, same kids, same clothes, and then I realized all of a sudden, I'm like, something's different, and I realized all the kids were wearing the same clothes, but they had exchanged clothes with one another, right? Literally, they don't have anything. They don't have family. They don't have parents. They don't have anybody to go to, but the very little that they did have, and these are 10, 11, 12-year-old children, the very little that they did have, they exchanged with one another for the sake of community. Though they wouldn't voice it as such, that's what was happening right before my eyes. I'm like, oh my God. Somehow they understand community at a far deeper and more incredible level than most North Americans will ever hope to experience in the midst of this tragedy. So that kind of gave me this, wow, the resilience of the human spirit to find human connection even in the utter depravity of war and violence and rape and anger. Powerful stuff, man, powerful stuff. So it does give me hope. It does give me hope.
Wow. That is powerful.
Yeah.
One word that you use a lot that I'm really interested in, I don't know much about, is shalom. I've always just assumed that it's just a Hebrew greeting of some kind. What is it exact? What does it mean?
Yeah, so it's shalom is great. It's a great word, or salam, if you're Muslim. Very similar, almost interchangeable. It's a lot of people think it just means kind of peace or a greeting, and it does mean that. It is a greeting, it is a farewell, it does mean peace, but really it means much more than that. It means wholeness. In a theological context, it means the delightedness of God, right? That there's some kind of goodness that's occurring here, that there's some kind of beautiful togetherness that's happening. So I love that word, and I also realize we live in a context in many places, even within our own community, of broken shalom. And so wherever we can embody shalom, goodness, delightedness, wholeness, we mend together. And really a big part of what launched me on this were images. And I talk about this a lot. Images can change, stories can change our imaginations. And I was at a lecture at the college that I attended, and this Pulitzer Prize winning war photojournalist named James Notway. He's got a great TED Talk online. But I was there, and he was, at the time, it was in the mid-90s, and he was showing on the large screen these big black and white photographs of Somalia at the time, of Bosnia, of Rwanda. And it was just hitting me like slide after slide of these incredibly powerful images, these palpable images of suffering. The Somalian refugees starving, the Bosnian children who are being shot up by snipers, the Rwandan genocide with the knife, the machete wounds, and the incredible humanity that I saw in each of these people. And I realized it hit me like thunder. I mean, here you've been given all this education, all this great privilege. I mean, really, I'm a white man living in the most powerful country in the history of the world with some of the best education. And yet this is going on in your world today. And you're alive with this today. And so what is the route? What are some pathways to see change, the shalom of goodness, of wholeness, of God to transpire in some of these places around the world? And so that kind of reframed my imagination, that there is hope in the midst of broken shalom, that we can find the beauty of reconciliation and renewal.
And is there, can you think of a specific time where you really felt shalom most powerfully, or that connection, or kind of putting you on the spot with this one, but is there anything that sticks out, like a moment that sticks out of really just being hit by the universe of just...
Yeah, sure. I'll tell you. It's kind of it's in some ways it's a comic story. Mm-hmm. In other ways, it's a real epiphany. At least to me, it's an enlivened kind of parable. And we were crossing the border into the Gaza territory from Israel. And the discrepancy between Israel and Gaza is incredible. And so we actually have to walk through it's a quarter mile of a cage outdoors, and it's we know it's a danger zone, and so we're walking, and somebody saw the contrails of a rocket that had just been fired over the border from Gaza into Israel, and then of course I don't want to get into that whole geopolitical reality because it's so complex. Mm-hmm. And the Israelis are so beautiful, and so are the Gazan people, and they're so beautiful. And so we're walking, and we get to eventually we get to the border guard, and this is really kind of the border where the conflict happens, right? And so it's Hamas soldiers who are kind of checking out our stuff, and they got their AK-47s and the beards and the whole nine, and it's a little bit intimidating. And one of our friends, who's a female, and she was carrying an empty, or it was a water bottle, like a plastic water bottle filled with not water, but like apple juice, right? And we're not thinking anything of it, and we're getting checked, and I'm the last one, and she's the one right before me, and she, all of a sudden the border guard starts yelling at her. We don't know why, and he's pointing at the bottle, and all of a sudden it hits us, and he's getting angry, visibly angry. It hits us. He thinks it's alcohol, which is strictly forbidden in the Gaza territory. It's a strict Muslim country. And so he's getting really irate. And then another border guard comes over, and we're like, oh, are we going to prison on the first day that we're here? And she tries to put the bottle up to his nose, and it's kind of an affront because it's a patriarchal society, and he gets even more angry. And so I'm just like, what do we do? And I learned a couple simple Arabic phrases, and I used those, a simple hello, greeting, how are you? And he kind of turned to me and he looked at me, and he stared at me for a bit, and then he left our friend alone. And what I didn't know I'd done was that I saved his face by intervening between a man and a woman. And so I didn't realize that had happened. And so he barely checks my bag, and he smiles at me, and he shakes my hand, and then he grabs my hand and puts my elbow on the table in front of him, and he stares me down, and he smiles. And I realize he wants to do an arm wrestle match right there, right? Which is crazy. I'm like, what do I do? And so one guy's counting the 3 in Arabic, and so we go at it, and I'm pretty strong, and he's pretty strong, and we actually, I'm like, okay, well, let's try this for a little bit, test it out. And so it just so happens we stalemate, and we're going for about 30 or 40 seconds, and then he lets go, I let go, and we laugh, and then he gives me a hug, and he's got his AK, and from one moment we're thinking prison, and the next moment there's this human connection that happens when we simply kind of are willing to enter into a simple hello, how are you? And that shalom all of a sudden appears majestically and beautifully out of nowhere. What was conflict now became this kind of incredible relational, beautiful experience between a Hamas border guard and some idiot Americans that are trying to cross over. But it was beautiful. I mean, it reframed his imagination about what Americans can be, because he only knows Americans as enemies, right? And it reframes our imagination about what Hamas border guard can be, because all we think of Hamas is a terrorist organization. But we're all humans, and there's an ability to connect at a deepest, most fundamental level.
Just a couple of dudes that like to arm wrestle. At the most
Simple.
fundamental level.
You wouldn't call that shalom necessarily. You wouldn't think of that, but I see that as just a simple, graceful moment of, wow, here's something that could have been conflict, ends up being grace and peace and laughter. And because we're laughing at the end of this, feeling good,
That's really beautiful.
Yeah.
And I think we should mention that the overseas work that you do is through CareCorps International, right?
CareCorps International.
Okay,
yeah.
great. And
Yeah. And Pass the Word is the local organization started by Kate Snyder, and then Jim Nelson and myself and Phil Strutner and Tia Suckin are all on the board of directors for that. And just a plug for that is we want to make it easy for people to come and help if they want to help, or just to be present. We have a lot of organizations have a lot of signing to do. If you have a compassionate, present heart, come on down. You don't have to give anything. You can just check it out. Saturday mornings, every Saturday morning, rain or shine, we're either at the picnic tables at El Estero Park, and the city has graciously let us use those, or the parking lot by the cemetery. And we're giving out clothes and bikes and tarps and tents. And really, it's not so much about the giving, although that's important, and the food. It's really about the beginnings of relational presence and friendship with one another. And so we've had community groups, schools, all religious organizations of every stripe come down. It's open to any church. It's open to any. We've had MIS students come down, CSUMB students come down. We've had legal aid people, veterinarian clinics, you name it. We'll take you.
So you're saying that anybody any single person can come down there to where you guys meet, and don't need to necessarily bring it, just show up.
Just show up and check it out, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. ish.
Okay.
And you don't just wait for Christmas or Thanksgiving to do something. We want to provide this immediately right now for people to get involved, and we've had incredible response over the last few years, and we're serving right now anywhere from 100 to 120 of our outdoor homeless friends on any given Saturday, or of course the beach church too on Sunday mornings. That's open to all people regardless of your religious beliefs or socioeconomic background or what you believe, what you don't believe, your sexual orientation. Everybody's welcome. It's a shame-free church.
Wow.
Yeah.
Shame-free church. Maybe someday that won't have to be qualified, but hey, that's it's really inspiring what you're doing, Brian. It's it really inspires me, and calls me, I think, to do greater things, and I hope that it has a similar effect for anyone that got to know this, and I really thank you for coming by and doing this.
Tyler, man, it's my pleasure. It's great talking to you, man. Thank you, friend.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Cool.
8, 3, 1, Rob!
Got some.
Shame-free church.
Shame-free church.
Defeats the purpose. It's raised Catholic, man. Gotta get my shame on.
You want shame?
Gotta get my shame on.